All right, guys, Matt and Pete here. We are excited because we've got the man, Paul Annacone, that we're going to be interviewing today. And really, he needs no introduction, right? I mean, the guy was great on the tour. Paul, you actually broke my heart, though. I got to tell you this. When I
Uh-oh.
was a kid, I went to the U.S. Open, and I think it was early rounds U.S. Open, and I was going, little kid, going to watch Johnny Mac,
His idol.
and my idol, and you just took him to the woodshed. So tell us a little bit about that before we get into the full introduction.
Yeah, well, at least you know the cliche, everybody gets their 15 minutes, and I guess that was mine. That was tough. I think might have been 86, 85, 86, and John and I played first round. I was one of the next few people to be seeded, so it wasn't a great draw for him, but it was a worse draw for me. So it was just one of those days where John was just coming back from his hiatus. He had spent some time away from the tour. And he was still a little bit vulnerable, and I played a great match, and it was, look, it was bittersweet. I grew up. John's only a few years older than me, but I grew up. He was one of my favorites and one of my idols as well. And I grew up on Eastern Long Island, so it was great, but it was also like, wow, what a bummer, John's out. And then I had to go, wait a second, but you're still in, so that's good.
Yeah, right. I beat him too bad, but hey, let's go win the U.S. Open.
Yeah.
All right. So, Paul, besides being a great player on tour, also coached the two GOATs, Pete Sampras and Federer. And so my first question is, talk about the difference of coaching Federer and Sampras as they got up in age, as they're getting 28, 29, 30. What was the difference between the two?
Well, that's the thing about individual sports coaching, which really intrigues me kind of the most, is that in team sports, you have systems and philosophies. Belichick has his, Popovich has his. Everybody's got their own system, and then the players come into that system, and the coach kind of really gets everybody familiarized with his system, and they conform to it. In an individual sport, especially with great players, you kind of have to figure out what that great player system is. It goes the other way. They don't come into your system. You go into their world. And then within their world, you have to figure out how to kind of articulate what needs to be articulated in a way that they buy in and believe. And Roger and Pete were very different people, which was really interesting to me because Pete was a very insular person who was very single-minded, but also really knew himself extremely well from a very young age. He knew that he had to keep things kind of streamlined and simplified on the tour. Small group of people around him, people that stayed around him, and also he was Sampras was one of the few athletes I've ever been around that could make the result orientation really important, and so important, yet not make him actually crack or get nervous because of it. Most players really need to be process oriented about how they're going to do things and then let the result take care of himself. Pete had one of the most endless pools of confidence I've ever seen, but not in an arrogant way. He always just felt like when it got close, he was going to find a way to win. So he could have that result orientation and not stifle his own talents. In other words, he still believed in that big moment without the what ifs creeping in. What if I don't make it? Or, uh-oh, here I am at the finish line. It was kind of conversely absorbed by him. He would kind of go, oh, great, I'm in the semis. Here's where I shine. And that's really unique about great players, is that they believe in themselves in the big moments. Roger did it and does it a little differently. Roger's a citizen of the world. He loves the process. He loves to practice. He loves the hotels. He loves different cultures. I mean, just go on social media. You'll see him doing something different every day, whether it's 2 days ago with the Golden State Warriors in Shanghai, or at a museum, or with animals, or seeing cultures outside of his own. He just embraces the entire process. And I think that that joy for what he does and his environment allows Federer, and has allowed Federer, to play at such a high level for so long. Because everyone thinks, oh, it's so great, they're playing pro sports. But I'm telling you, I've lived it for the last 30 years. It's tiring. And these guys, no matter whether they're flying first class or private, you travel 35 weeks a year around the world. After 15, 20 years, it's a little bit of a drain. And it's the only sport really where you do it naked. And what I mean by that is you got no teammates. It's up to you out there on the court. You better figure it out. Otherwise, you can't rely on your halfback or your point guard or your shortstop to bail you out. It's up to you. So all that stuff about tennis makes it, I think, really intriguing. And Roger and Pete's personalities are very, very different and unique. The biggest commonality they have is that, number one, they believe in themselves at the biggest moments. And number two, they have a great short-term memory. They're able to forget what just happened and allow them to play what's about to happen without any baggage from the past. So a lot of that stuff I talk about in my book that you guys have, a lot of different people have gotten the same accolades and got to that place. But that belief in big moments and the ability to focus on what's about to happen without having bad baggage from what just happened, I think that's really essential in all walks of life, really, if you want to be successful. So those guys do it a little bit differently. And at 36 years of age, it's still pretty fun to watch Roger do it.
Yeah, everybody loves watching Roger. I got one follow-up question I'm going to hand over to Matt.
Sure.
You started to talk about how Sampras just seemed to have this unshakable confidence, especially in the big moments. Would you say that Roger was the same, or does Roger get a little more nervous about things than Sampras?
No, I think they both get nervous. I think, and everyone that says they don't get nervous, I don't buy it. Because I think the greats get nervous. They just know how to manage it better. And I think Roger's game style and in his era makes it maybe show a little bit differently because the points are longer and there takes more structure to it to generally win the point. So you have to hit more shots to finish. In Pete's era and his time of greatness, when things got nervous, he was generally either serving, and in my opinion, has the greatest serve game, not just service game that I've ever seen. And so Pete trusted that in big moments. So it was a 1-2 kind of thing. That's it on the serve. And in the return style in big moments, Pete found ways to engage in the point the way he wanted to finish him. So I think the reason why maybe it seems like Roger might get a little more nervous is he's playing in an era where he's got to hit more shots to finish points. And so if you got to hit more shots, it's more likely you're going to miss one or two, particularly with Roger's style of play in this era. And that's one of the reasons why Rafa's so great, is that in the big moments, he has so much margin. With that topspin, he's hitting the ball 6 feet over the net and has unbelievable wheels. So he can rely on his wheels and his margin in moments of pressure, whereas Roger's go-to is offensiveness. And so in this era, that style matchup has led Rafa to win more times than Roger because of those things and the fact that lefty forehand to Roger's backhand. So Roger and Pete a little different. The era's a little different. So what we see contextually is really about the eras and style of play versus one guy getting more nervous than the other.
Very good. Matt?
You talked about in your book the power of belief in oneself, and then I thought it was interesting you linked it to listening. And you said specifically in the book that Roger allows himself, Roger Federer, for anyone out there who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Roger allows himself the freedom to hear what is being said without twisting it around in his mind, without smothering it with emotions that detract from the learning process for players to be aware of.
Wow, did I really say that? That almost sounds smart. No, one of the hardest things in individual sports too, and you'll find this with all athletes, I think, and all people that have ego, is it's hard to make things impersonal. It's hard not to take it as an affront to you. And what I was so amazed at with Roger, and Pete was like this too, if they trust you and you have credibility and you're in their inner circle and you communicate well, you can say what you think is happening critically, as long as it's constructive, and you have to be able to back it up. So it's the ability to hear that constructive criticism, and it's the ability to kind of process what's going on pragmatically. And I think most athletes are able to do that. Even the really passionate ones, like someone like Rafa, problem solves. He's very passionate. He's very energetic, but he doesn't let the energy kind of stifle his pragmatism. Nadal, he's able to sit there, and that's one of the reasons why he's so deliberate while he's playing, is he's processing stuff. So I think great athletes are able to sift through what us normal folks do, which is get wrapped up in emotion of things, and let that hinder our ability to go through some pragmatic processes that go, here's what's happening, here's what I'm best at, how do I get to this scenario so that I win or lose doing what I do best? And that's a really oversimplified version of what the greats do. And I was fortunate to live it firsthand with Pete and Roger, where they're able in those moments of, dead, stifling silence at center court at Wimbledon when it's 4-all in the 5th set and there's 8 million people on TV watching and 12,000 people there where you can hear a pin drop. They're able to, okay, here's what I'm about to do. No, nothing else. There's no clutter. There's no what ifs. There's no doubt. There's no, this might happen. There's no emotional override that makes them unable to execute that. So that's all about the ability to practice processes that allow you to do that in those moments. And whether you're in a boardroom, making a pitch to a 12-member board for a big sale, or you're on center court at Wimbledon, or you're trying to figure out a way to get 4th and 1 on a football team, it's the same mechanism that you need to execute. And I found it really interesting over the years to watch greats do it. They do it different ways, but they get to that same ability to, here's what's about to happen, here's what I do best, I trust it, I'm doing it, let's go. And
I got a follow-up question before my next question, because I found one thing you said very interesting, that you can play these matches and you can kind of separate yourself emotionally. And I think one of the hardest things to do for a coach, and even when I was playing, don't talk to me after I lose. So how soon after a match could you talk to a Sampras or a Federer about what happened? How soon they want to talk about it, and how deep did you go into it as far as to pick out some nuggets to improve for the next time you face that situation?
Well, two things. One is, again, everybody's different. You're exactly right. I spent some time with Sloane Stephens as well. She was a lot younger. She needed a little more time to process stuff. She was 21 years old when I was with her, and after she lost, she needed some space. She needed, a night just to let things process out, and then you go back and chat the next day. I talked to Roger right after the match for 3 minutes. He's into his press conference for an hour. Then we're back at his place, and we're chatting about the match comfortably, just a few generic things. Then a couple bullet points, and then it's done. There's no really residual emotional baggage that's built up. And Pete was the same way. Pete was able to really be crushed. I remember being back at my house in New York after he lost the French Open one year, and we were sitting by the pool, and he was pretty crushed about another French Open that he wasn't able to win. And I remember sitting by the pool talking about what had happened. And he did it in a way where he's disappointed, but that disappointment didn't stifle his self-belief, and also didn't hinder kind of the ability to grab what happened without letting it get to the point where you go, oh no, I can't do this. Just like, oh, here's what happened, here's what I need to do to get better, and then you move on. So, again, I don't want to harp on that word pragmatism, but it's really important. And as a former player and also as a huge sports fan, look, I'm watching the Yankees yesterday in the playoffs, and you hear the crowd and you see all the stuff going on, and a pitcher that's trying to close. I mean, those moments, your pulse is up. There is stuff going on. But whether you're the pitcher on the Yankees, or you're Roger trying to serve out a match, or you're Tom Brady trying to drive down the field, or you're Joe Smith talking to all the execs at IBM, you better figure out how to slow your pace down of your heart. You better figure out how to think your way through it, and you better trust those processes. And that was really the genesis of the book. I was so amazed at the ability these great players have at taking these big moments and just going, okay, yeah, it's a big moment. Here's what I have to do. That doesn't mean they're always going to succeed, but they trust their processes. And the first time that they're out there is the hardest time, just like anybody else. And so over time, it becomes habit forming, and those habits are either good or bad. And the great players turn them into good habits. So everything is process oriented, everything is trusting your skills, and that disappointment and how you process it that you ask about is there for everybody. If it's not, you probably don't care enough. But one of the things that I found about Roger too is I remember he lost to it was either the match he lost to Tsonga at Wimbledon after being up 2-0 in the quarters, or it was one of those matches at the US Open where he had match points against Novak in the semis and lost. And I wrote about this in the book as well. But I remember talking to him about it afterwards, and he had been playing with his kids, and he'd seemed pretty comfortable. And, you know, this was probably 4 or 5 hours later, but it was still pretty crushing. And I remember talking to him about it. And again, he was just like, look, you know, here's what happened. We talked about that. And it's really, it sucks. You know, it's not great, but it's over with. And I've had a great run. I've won a lot of tournaments. I put myself in a lot of good positions. And I think I'm going to put myself in more. So what happened today isn't going to define the macro version of, number one, my tennis career, but more importantly, number two, who I am and how I go about things. So to me, I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing to be able to flush that out and really believe what you're saying. And I think that, again, that's another key why at 36, Federer is still out there. He loses, you know, that match at the US Open this year to Del Potro. Sure, it hurts. Sure, it hurts. But okay, let's evaluate it. Let's sit back, have a nice dinner. Here's what happened. Okay, next task. Now what do we do?
That's really cool. We're talking to Paul Annacone, who's written a great book, Coaching for Life. And I think you just made a great point as far as like not just letting it to sink in with your identity if you win or lose. You're just not a tennis player, you're a person. One of the things I'd like to know more about, I really loved reading this in the book, how you would sit down and really go through the plan out the season, the tournaments, the training together. How detailed did that get between Fed and Sampras, and how long were the conversations and all that? How much is on your end? How much is on their end?
Sure, it's, you know, every player is different and every stage of development is different. You know, when you're on the pro tour and you're established, you're able to kind of plan out your year. And so with people like Roger and Pete in particular, those two guys, they're great players. And so they know where their ranking is, so they can set out their business responsibilities. They can set out their tournament responsibilities. And most importantly, they can set out their life responsibilities kind of early on. So really, you know, kind of in September of the previous year, you start to formulate what's going to happen, how you're going to put things together. So with Roger, I would sit down with Pierre Paganini, who's a strength and conditioning person, Tony Godzik, who's Roger's manager, Severin Luti, who coached him with me, and also at that time it was Stefan Vivier, who was the physio who took care of his body. So we would sit at a table and kind of prioritize what the goals are and then work backwards. And Roger does a very good job of having kind of a periodized plan of how he goes through the year. And he does it in such a way that, again, it's pretty unemotional. You know, people, and I talk about on Tennis Channel all the time, who's ranked #1 this week? Where are you that week? You know, people counting points, chasing accolades. And Roger and Pete was the same way. They're very good at not getting caught up in the emotion of, uh-oh, if I skip Indian Wells, that's 1,000 points. It's, at the end of the day, I'm good enough. I'm going to get my points. If I'm #4 in the world in March, I know that there's still 3 more majors to be played. I know there's plenty of points to accumulate. I've got to set up a process that allows me to play my best tennis at the big moments during the year. And I tell you, Roger and Pete were great at that. And Roger still is. Tim Henman, who I coached, was also great at it. Tim was very good at trying to maximize where he was going to play best. Sloane was a different challenge. You know, Sloane was younger. She was 21, and she would have a propensity a little bit to get wrapped up in the points accumulation of where her ranking was, because she came on the tour with a big splash when she beat Serena at the Australian Open. I believe it was in maybe 2013. So all of a sudden she was thrown onto that stage, and she kind of wasn't ready to get into a macro mindset. So every result was very emotional, pro or con. So now, since Sloane just won the U.S. Open, I'll be very interested to see what she and her team do moving forward, to trust those skills, to know there's going to be some losses, to understand the length of the year, and more importantly, the length of the season. So that's a very rambling answer, but the simple answer is kind of August, September of the year before you start to formulate the priorities of what the player's trying to do. And then you work with their team to make sure the boxes are ticked in each category to give the player the best chance at the biggest moments.
I think Sloane still does care a lot about the points, because I remember we were talking to her in Cincinnati and she was telling us how much fun it was to have the really low ranking and see herself pop over other people.
Yeah, it's easier to play, right? I mean, look, for everybody, when the expectations are lower, it's much easier to play. And I think in some ways, that mortality that Sloane saw with her injury helped her have a sense of urgency. But in other ways, because the ranking was so low, she kind of was just playing this summer. And then before she knew it, she was in the quarters, then semis, then finals of the U.S. Open, and she was able to manage it. And some of that was because the expectation in her own mind kind of helped her relieve a little bit of pressure, which is normal. And so now it's a new landscape for her, so she's got to learn to manage that. She's had a couple of not great results since the U.S. Open in Asia, but she's got to learn to manage that, which she will. And that's one of the things that I found so amazing when I talked to Pete Sampras when he was 23. I asked him about rankings and stuff, and he said, one of the hardest things to realize is it's much more difficult to stay there than to get there. And it took me a while to just get comfortable realizing, okay, I'm number one in the world. I'm not going to panic every tournament. I'm going to look at the year as a whole, and I'm number one for a reason. So I'm going to be able to get there, but I've got to get settled in with it. So he got comfortable doing that. Now with Sloane as a new major title holder, she's just got to get comfortable with that scenario of being a major champion, which she's damn good enough to do it. She just did it. So now she's got to figure out how to manage it throughout the year, and that's the next task for her.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting in your book is you talked about trying to change the core of your game in the middle of your career. So for anyone who doesn't know, you were a big-time serve and volley guy. I think you might have invented the saber move because you were all about getting into the net no matter what. And then about halfway in the career, you talk about in the book how you tried to change and play more from the baseline, work on your ground strokes. Talk about the good and bad that came from messing with your core game.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I talk about in the book as well, knowing your own game. And one of my, I'm one of these, I like to look back at life, and I think people that say you don't have any regrets, that seems weird to me. I mean, I do have regrets. I love my life, and I love the good and bad about it. And that is one of my regrets, is that I didn't trust my game. I didn't trust the ability of how I played, because no one else played like that. And was I going to get to number one in the world doing that? Probably not. But I think getting to 12 in the world is probably where my talent was. That was where my talent level was based on my skill set. But that skill set kind of went down the fork in the road the wrong way when you mentioned that scenario. I didn't trust it. So I had a lot of great former players and coaches whispering in my ear saying, you got to get better from the back of the court. You got to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And in the book, I think I also mentioned my brother, who's coaching me, as I worked what I thought was harder, I saw my ranking go from 12 to 35. And I asked my brother, and he said, you look much better losing now. You look better losing. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, points are great. You're just losing them. And he said, your style of play is your style of play. That's what got you to 12 in the world. It's unique. You're the best when you're at the net. Find a way to get there. Let's figure out how to get better at doing that. And after I bought back into that from my brother Steve, I actually won a tournament in Vienna shortly thereafter. So he was right. And that style probably wasn't going to get me to be the best player in the world, because there were holes in it. But if I had read my book back then and I had realized this is me, this is how I need to play, just stick with it. And if I bought that, I would have stayed up there probably longer, and I probably would have had a lot more self-doubt and a lot more clarity in my process. But what do they say? Youth is wasted on the young, and you don't get wise until you're older. So, what could have been, could have been. But I'm thrilled with what I was able to do as a player. 12 in the world, I'm really proud of. Small town kid from East Hampton, New York, got to be 12 in the world. So I'm proud of that. But again, that was part of my process going through the book, is that I should have hung with that a little bit longer, and I didn't.
One of the things that's so impressive about watching Roger through his career is, when he first came out, like, how can you play any better tennis than that? And maybe at 36, he's even a more complete player this year, but he's kind of noticing the backhand drive down the line. So when you worked on a new tactic with a Sampras or Federer, take for these guys to actually implement it to where they felt comfortable in a match? Are they just so talented you just say, hey, you should do this, and they just go, okay, and then all of a sudden you're watching them the next day doing it? Or was it something that they had to practice for a certain amount of months before they're like, okay, I think I can do this in a match now and pull this off fairly consistently?
I think the big thing with great players is you better be able to back it up. You better be able to explain why they need to do it. And you have to understand they're great for a reason. And even though those two guys in particular are great guys, they're really nice. You better be able to explain why they need to do it. I'll give you a great example with Pete. I was trying to get Pete to chip and come in behind second serve returns more when he was a little younger. And he would always say, why should I do that? Because he had a very guttural feeling that once the point started, I'm just better. I'll find a way to win the match once the point started. If I come to net, I'm giving that guy a one-off chance to pass me. And so I had to convince Pete, you're a great athlete. You're amazing at the net. Why would you not want to finish there a little more often to instill some fear and instill a message in your opponent early in the match that can pay dividends? And he would say, well, what do you mean? And so I remember we were in Australia one year, and I was trying to get Pete to do that. And in one in particular match, he chipped and came in 2 or 3 times in the first set and lost all of them, won the first set and won the match. He came off the court, and I said, really great that you chipped and charged early in that match in the first set. And he said, what do you mean? I lost all 3 points. And I said, yeah, but you got into the tiebreaker and you got 2 double faults. Why do you think you got double faults? So you better be able to explain the quantitative things that happen plus the qualitative, which also leads me into the analytics part of evaluating what's going on. You have to understand why the numbers are there, not what they are. So you take numbers in isolation and you walk on a tightrope. So those things don't necessarily, just says whoever double faulted twice in the tiebreaker against Pete. Well, why? Well, some of it's because it's Pete Sampras. The other part of it's because it's a tiebreak. And the third part of it is because he came in 3 times earlier in that first set. And even though he lost all 3 points, this guy's now in a tiebreaker going, uh-oh, I'm playing Sampras. I got to hit a second serve now. He's come in a few times. So you have to be able to prove to the players beyond just what numbers say what works. And the second part of that is that what you said is they are so talented, Roger and Pete in particular. It's amazing how quickly they get comfortable doing something once they buy in. That's why you have to be able to convince them. Once they believe it, you can just say, Roger, here's what I want you to do. Here's how it works, and here's why. And once he believes that, the guy's so gifted, he can go out there for, let's say he's hitting over his backhand that we saw him do so successfully this year. People talk about this new kind of revelation of Roger Federer. He's always been able to do that. He's always done it. This is the first year, and Australia in particular, that's the first time probably we've ever seen him do it for 5 sets against Rafa Nadal. He loses 1 or 2 sets or it isn't successful against Rafa, he'll back up and revert to the style that hasn't been successful. In Australia, that was the first time I've seen Roger do it for 5 sets without being wrapped up in the consequence or the moment of what was happening, even if he lost the point.
So are you saying that?
Hang on 1 sec. E?
Sure.
Yeah, one of those is okay. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
Back. So did I ruin your thought process?
Oh no, that's okay. I can edit that out too. Oh man, my thought though. I was gonna say. So
Roger believed in. Remember, I was saying Roger believed in that process, and that in Australia was probably the first time we've seen him totally stick with it against Rafa over 5 sets. Usually he could do it a set, set and a half, 2 sets. Then Rafa's will, Rafa's margin, his footwork, his ability to make Roger hit extra balls kind of would chip away just fractionally, and that's all it takes. And then Roger's 3 feet deeper in the court, and then it's up to Rafa what's happening. In Australia in 2017, that didn't happen. Even when Roger started losing, he just kept going, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to play, and let's see how it goes. And that was the first time I think I've seen him do it over 5 sets consistently against Rafa, successfully on a hard court. And from 3-1 in the 5th set, you know, he won 5 games in a row. So he was pretty impressive in big moments doing it.
Yeah, that was the best time of my life watching. What about 2009 Australia? Would you say, you know, in matches like that where he lost to Rafa, you almost made it sound like Roger got a little scared or nervous, and you said he reverted back to the more comfortable kind of autopilot play.
Well, I think, you know, I wouldn't use the word either of those words, scared or nervous. I think players go to default modes, and when you're great like Federer, and particularly the first half of your career, when you're so great, you can kind of play however you want and still win. Because in my opinion, Roger was so good strategically, he could kind of do whatever he wanted from 2002 or 3 until about 2007 or 8. And then all of a sudden, Rafa became Rafa. Novak started to become Novak. Andy sprung onto the scene. And the style matchup was that Roger would have to hit more balls. Well, guess what? For 5 years, when Roger's offensive play wasn't perfect, he could revert to go back to hit more balls and beat everybody else in the world. But Rafa, Novak, and Andy were so great that when Roger's old habits of the last 5 years would kick in, maybe not quite good enough to beat Rafa over 5 sets. And so I think it was more of a creature of habit versus fear, or versus not trusting his ability to be offensive. Because remember, in those 5 years, he was dominant, and he was able to do it many different ways. And he was able to be the steady, defensive, great athlete guy when the offensive stuff didn't work and when he had to hit more balls in pressure situations. But now all of a sudden, he's got the great Rafa Nadal, who's, in my opinion, if not the best, one of the best of all time in those big moments because of the margin of his shots and because of his footwork. So that really was the kind of cause and effect of the Rafa mentality.
One of the things our players struggle with is the ability to execute a game plan. And especially against younger and better players, I think a lot of times this main issue is mental. And in the book, you were talking about Sloane Stephens feeling the pressure of repeating the early success, the frustration, and the doubts that she felt after some bad results. What would you say to our players who feel like they just can't execute?
I think a lot of that, the reason the doubts, like you say, the doubts that they have, they feel like they can't execute it. To me, 2 things. One is it's about the baggage that has been built up to that point in time in their career. By baggage, every day you create baggage, good and bad. And if the baggage that they've created is doubt or insecurity or unsuredness, when adversity strikes in, that happens. The doubt, that insecurity, or being unsure all creeps in. Now, if the baggage is a positive sense of inevitability, a trust in your talent, a big picture mentality, when that comes in where they can't execute, they go, okay, didn't happen today, but I'm 14, I'm 16, I'm 18 years of age. I'm playing to get better. I'm going to practice that style so that the clarity of that style matching up with my skill sets is inevitably going to make me execute at a high level. So they accept what happened, but they've got to be reassured and they've got to be really clear that that style of play fits their game plan, and understand that on that day, number 1, they either got beat by a better player, number 2, they didn't play so well, number 3, they're still developing, or number 4, all of the above. And you have to be kind of pragmatic about it, and just instead of going, I just can't execute that style of play, that's where it's our job as coaches to go, wait a second, let's evaluate your style of play, let's evaluate what happened today, and let's evaluate how to get better at what you're doing, because your style of play suits you, and today you were a little bit off, or Joe Blow was really on, or you're just not as good right now at this moment, but this is how you're going to play your best tennis down the road.
Very cool. In the book, because we're talking about styles of play and knowing your game, you talk about two different types of mentalities. You got the magician and then you got the mechanic. Can you explain the difference between the two, and then also maybe go into how, as a player, can you identify which one you are, and then how should you train basically once you figure out who you are?
Yeah, that was one of my, I really enjoyed that chapter because I got to spend, a lot of my coaching career with two of the best magicians ever, and Sampras and Federer. And by magician, I mean, it's kind of a generic term of someone that is feel oriented, artistically oriented, grasps things very easily, very comfortably, isn't technically driven, technically comprehends, but isn't technically driven, doesn't gain confidence solely by repetition, gains confidence by trust and feel, and inner self-belief. And again, that is created through their development. And then there's the mechanic, who is, and neither one of these is right or wrong. There's some unbelievably successful mechanics. Yvonne Lendl was more of a mechanic. Chrissy Everett was more of a mechanic. Jim Courier was more, and those are awesome historical champions, but they knew how they needed to play. And I always used to make the analogy, if Pete ever trained like Jim Courier, Pete would have retired when he was 24. And if Jim Courier ever trained like Pete, Jim Courier never would have been #1 in the world. So they knew their own game styles. And to me, this is probably the hardest thing in the world for a coach to understand, because you have to do this at a young age. When Pete Sampras was very young, he hit millions of balls. He was with Robert Lansdorp doing millions of drills, hitting thousands of forehands, thousands of backhands. So he ingrained all of the great technique and repetition and trust when he was younger. When he became 19, 20, 21, 22, he started to formulate that he was, and look, it's not a conscious decision. He doesn't go, okay, I'm a magician. He goes, okay, this is what I need to do, how I need to prepare to play my best tennis. It doesn't mean he didn't train hard. What it means, more importantly, is he trained smart. He knew what he needed to do to play his best tennis. And same with Jim Courier or Yvonne Lendl. They had to train a different way. They had to hit more balls to feel comfortable. So as a coach, you have to try to set that up and trust it so that the players can do that in the biggest moments.
Got the next one?
Can you guys hear? Let me ask this guy to move. Can you guys hear? Is that drowning things out?
I was thinking, what is that sound?
Hang on a second. Let me walk through. What are you doing? Okay, I'm going to see if I can go into another room and see if it'll get a little quieter.
Okay.
Sorry.
Part 2, the China room or whatever.
I'll go into the family room here. It's a little different setting, but hopefully it won't be as noisy. Does that work for you guys?
Yeah, that works.
Is that right?
Okay, you ready for the next one?
All right, we're back.
Nice.
So I was really struck by the concept of college mode, and that's in your book. You're talking about the difference between someone who's, a good college tennis player, and then the difference between someone who's good enough to actually make it on the pro tour. You're saying college mode's basically focusing on a loss and replaying it in your mind. And then you said that the pro, someone who's not in college mode, forgets the negative, focuses on the big picture, it's free of doubt and insecurity. And I feel like, coaches like you and Pete, you guys started playing with good coaches at a young age. You guys were always good. People like me, I started a lot later in life. I didn't have a coach around. I didn't have good technique. I didn't learn proper technique for several years. So I feel like we get hit by this insecurity and fear a lot harder than guys like you who were pretty good early on. And I think in TennisCon, a lot of our over 50 players, you're going to hear a lot of their stories are, I started playing tennis when I was 40, or I started when I was 55. So how can you coach us on this college mode mentality and getting out of it? Obviously, we never did play college tennis,
Yeah.
So it's a little different for us.
It is, and that's why when I wrote the book, I was kind of like, the seedling was more about what makes great players great and not just players. By players, I mean people. Whatever they do, what makes Les Moonves at CBS so successful? Why was Steve Jobs Steve Jobs? What about Elon Musk Elon Musk with the cars and the stuff he's doing with Tesla? Why are these guys excellent? What are the traits outside of tennis as well? So what I would say about the reason I'm bringing it up is people that start later, think about the traits that made you successful in whatever else you were doing. And those traits definitely translate. The problem is that when you start anything in later life, it's much easier to get knocked off the rails. That's why, like, when they say, you're going to learn, if you want to learn languages, do it when you're younger. You absorb it quicker. You absorb it with less baggage attached, with less what ifs, everything when you're younger just kind of gets into your system much quicker. You start playing tennis when you're 40, you've got a lot of stuff to break through, good and bad. And the thing I mentioned about college wasn't so much, the thing I was talking about with college is that because there's more chunks in the year where you're not playing quite as much, you have the team environment, you have more time to kind of mull over losses and defeats. On the pro tour, every week, everyone leaves a tournament pissed off except one person. That's not great odds. So you better figure out how to get over things real quickly and move on. So my simple advice would really be, think about what makes you and what has made you successful in the other endeavors in your life as you're starting to play tennis. Don't forget about tennis. Think about the habits that made you successful in your accounting, in your carpentry, in your masonry, in whatever you do. And that goes hand in hand with how you should react to the adversity of trying to get better at tennis. And that's why knowing the kind of player you are, number one, and reverting back to magician and mechanic also will help you. I need a lot of repetition. I'm one of these guys that needs to do it a lot. I'll feel more comfortable. Or I'm a feel person. I need to be happy about it. I need to make sure that I've got a very kind of existential or macro vision, and I've got to be able to float around the court, because that's kind of how I got better becoming a guitarist. That's how you have to understand who you are to maximize those skills. And that's really hard to do. The older we get, the harder it is to change those things, good and bad. You have a lot of good habits when you get older. That's great. You've got some bad habits that hold you back a little bit. I think that that's a big challenge. And that's why when I look at these greats, and I look at the Samprases, and I look at the Federers and the Nadals and the Chris Everetts and Serenas and Martinas, Tracy Austins and Lindsay Davenports, all these people that have been great, and the Jim Couriers, they have this innate ability to sift through who they are as people and find the positive process that gets them to the place where in the biggest moments they believe. And if you start something at 40 years of age or 30 years of age, you've got a lot of ingrained habits to accept, and also understand how to jump over some of those habits that have created hurdles for you. And that just takes time. It can be done. It takes self-awareness, it takes discipline, and it takes practice, but you have to take a lot of time, and you have to be really kind of driven and also kind of compassionate with yourself as you're trying to do it.
I think you made some great points. I think the big advantage, and I just had somebody come visit me yesterday. I told them, what the big advantage though of playing and starting this when you're older is that you're going to be 100% locked in and focused. So many times you're teaching a junior, and you can just tell they're not really understanding how important what you're teaching is, where someone who's an adult, they're paying their own money, they're there, and so they can actually improve, even though they say, can you teach an old dog new tricks? A lot of times you can, because they want to learn.
Sure you can. You're 100% right. The only balance I think that people have to realize at that stage is there's a fine line between two things: working hard and working smart, and wanting it bad and wanting it too bad. And so if you can balance those with the older players that are starting, you're 100% right. They're locked and loaded. They're ready to go, but they've got to find that balance of accepting imperfection and wanting it badly, but not too badly, and making sure that they're working smart, not just hard. And by smart, it's again assessing their skill sets, assessing where they are in their development and their age, what they are realistically able to do, and no matter what they are or aren't able to do, figuring out, okay, what kind of game does Susie need to play to get as good as she can be for the club tournaments at her club. How is Susie going to win and play her best tennis? Is she really athletic? Does she need to make her opponents hit more balls? Does she need to be more aggressive on her big serve? And then as a coach, you cater it to that person. And that's one of the things, again, circling back to right at the beginning, that's why I love tennis. It's individual. And as a coach, you got to figure out how to size up that player you're working with, good, bad, and indifferent, and figure out how to match up those skill sets to figure out how they can be the best that they can be with their skills.
Very cool. I got one more question I'm going to hand over to Matt. This is kind of switching gears a little bit, but it's something I've always been curious about. With a Sampras and a Federer, we always want to know, as people watching, do they have a playbook, and how deep is the playbook, and is this just for them, the way they play, and they're just going to play the same against everybody, or how much X's and O's do you sit down with a Federer and go over the Nadal match versus playing Djokovic versus playing Murray? How much does the playbook change?
Well, it's very different. Pete, again, different personalities. Pete needed clear, concise kind of pre-match coaching. He didn't want 35 minutes, 40 minutes of detailed stuff. Couple simple patterns. What are the patterns of my opponent? How do they plug in with what I do with my strengths? What's happened in the past? How do I want to play big points? Boom. Get that into Pete's head really clearly, really simply in a 10-minute conversation. He's got it and he's off. Roger is a little different. Henman was like this too. Roger and Henman can sit around and talk about stuff for quite a while and sift through different things and possibilities and why they work and why they don't, and not let that affect the simplicity of what they're trying to do on the court. Henman wanted to finish at the net as often as possible. Okay, Tim, so how are we going to do that today based on your opponent? We could talk about it for a while. It wouldn't confuse him. Roger would like to hear about what's happened in the past. We'd even, go through some videos sometimes, go through some clips about what had worked, what hadn't, and why. But when I go back in hindsight and I retroactively watch the matches and the patterns, in the big points, it's pretty simple. Federer hits spots with his serve, and he gets a first strike in with his forehand. If he's doing that, he's going to win or lose doing what he does best. Sampras, watch what he does at big moments. Where's that serve going to go? Which is all the different spots. That's why he's so great. What's he going to do on his second serve, and how is he going to impact his opponent's second serve? And so in those big moments, knowing those guys so well, I can kind of watch the matches in retrospect and go, mission accomplished or not. They may not win the match, but as long as they do it doing what they do best, fine. That's what I want to instill in them. And the same with Tim Henman. Did you get to the net? Were you playing too many points from the baseline? And with Sloane, when she was younger, she still didn't have a great sense of what her game was. She's a great athlete. She can absolutely unload on her forehand. She's got a great two-hander, but she's also a great counterpuncher. She can run and make you hit more balls. So I even think today she's still trying to figure out exactly what her game is. So for instance, when she beat Madison in the finals of the US Open, to me, going back, one of the things I thought going into that match, first final for both of them, Madison can absolutely take the racket out of your hands because she hits the ball so big. But it's a finals of a major. Sloane's the best mover on the women's tour. She's the best absorber of pace. If she's in a mindset where she's going to make you hit a couple balls extra, combined with the pressure of the US Open final for the first time, edge to Sloane Stephens. Madison doesn't have a ton of margin. First US Open final. The play is to maybe overplay in that moment and have a few too many errors if Sloane's wheels come into play. A lot like what Nadal does to Roger. And that's kind of what happened. So I guess it's about, again, so much of this is about circling back to understanding what your game is and understanding the player of how much they want to hear to buy into what that game is and what's going to happen in the pressure moments. And I love the fact that I love any player that can be self-aware enough to know what they do well and to trust that in the big moment and go out and do it. And if you lose, you come up and go, too bad I lost. But you know what? I was doing what I do best and it wasn't good enough today. That's great. So for me, again, it's self-evaluation and understanding that the players, some of them want to hear more and less. Pete would like to hear a little bit less pre-match. Roger could go through more conversational. Same with Tim Henman. Again, as a coach, you've got to sift through what's their personality type, how much information can they absorb, what's too much information before they get confused. I mean, my own coaching philosophy historically has been, how little can I say to get the player to do what they need to do? and how little can I say to get them to buy into a philosophy? Because I think a lot of it's instinct, and the more complicated you make it in bigger pressure situations, the more likely you'll lose lack of clarity, and more likely you'll lose clarity and lose confidence. So simplicity, clarity, and buy-in. And for me, it's about making the player self-sufficient and able to problem solve in big moments. And that's why I'm always on a little bit of a tug of war with the on-court coaching thing. It sounds great in theory, but the old dinosaur in me is kind of like, I love that you have to figure it out by yourself out there. I love that you have no place to hide. I love seeing the greats and the not so greats in moments of adversity trying to problem solve. To me, that's awesome with tennis. I think it's awesome. So I have a little bit of I continually battle with myself with the on-court coaching because of that. I don't not like it, but I'm not sure.
Were you surprised that you said, your mission is to get them to buy in with as few words as possible? Were you surprised that Roger wanted to talk so much about tennis? Is he like a big tennis nerd?
No, because he's a citizen of the world. It's his life. I mean, he likes to talk to people. He's interested in other places. He's interested in things that he doesn't know a ton about. And one of his biggest assets is, like you mentioned before, the ability to hear things and process things without getting tangled up in them, without making self-evaluations or creating insecurities. So that just goes in with his MO. He's very happy to sit and listen and talk and not pass emotional judgment about things, just gather the information and see what's practically applicable and what isn't. But I mean, one of the first things I saw with Roger is, when I asked him to do something, he said, I'm fine with that, but sometimes I'm going to say why. Why? If I'm not sure, I said, absolutely. You've got to say why. I don't want you to be this, okay, just do this, just do that. So I would explain why I want him to use the short, low chip cross-court backhand. I would explain why it's important he goes strong up the line with his one hand, or why it's important he use the body serve. Not just do it, but here's what it creates. And as a coach, you have to kind of get those things inherently in your player, whether it's Roger or Joe or Johnny or Frank or Sally or Harry. You've got to get them to understand that stuff so that the why becomes just part of the conversation.
You got another question?
A little bit of a follow-up. I was just wondering, what are some of those things that Roger's looking for? You were saying like how important the body serve is, or you're saying, one key for him is he's got to find the spot with that first serve and then get the big first strike in with the forehand. Now he's 36, he's gotten older. What are some of these things he's trying to do out there on the court to make it work where he can still win at the highest level?
I think he's shortening the points. He's understanding that, he's still a great athlete, but he's 36, and probably 3 out of 5 sets for 7 matches over 14 days at the majors. That's a big ask for him. That's a lot of tennis. So this year in Australia, I think he beat 4 top 10 guys in Australia. And that may be the first time, I can't remember him doing that. And for him to beat 4 top 10 guys in Australia, 3 out of 5 sets, that's pretty impressive. And the reason he was able to do it is he made the points very, very offensive and very dictatorial on his side. Even his 5-setter with Rafa, it wasn't a 5-hour match. He was ripping the ball. You saw him beat Burdick incredibly easily by being just absolutely offensively overwhelming. Kei Nishikori, I think that was 5 sets as well, but it was very offensive, beating Wawrinka in the finals 5 sets, but really offensive. So he's understanding how he needs to play stylistically and not getting wrapped up in momentary success or failure and sticking with that. So while Roger understands, sure, he can grind it out when he has to. He doesn't want to all the time. And he also knows that that's why he has to take breaks in the year, because at 36, you just don't recover like you used to. So again, that pragmatism and his thoughtfulness and mindfulness of understanding who he is and where he is in his career is really important. That's why somebody like Nadal to me is even more amazing. At 31, he needs repetition. He needs to hit 1,000,000 balls. He needs to play 1,000,000 matches. Otherwise, his confidence isn't there. And to see what Rafa's done this year is absolutely off the charts. That he's been able to sustain it in more of a mechanics mode. That's a lot. He does his preparation and his ability is very labor intensive. So when you see Rafa doing what he's doing, that's amazing.
Very cool. I've got one more, and then Matt's got one more, and then we're going to let you go and tell people how they can get your book. Going back to Sampras versus Agassi matchup, reading Open, Agassi would talk about the frustration of playing Sampras and the feeling that, he just didn't give me anything the whole match. Agassi thrives on rhythm, and he felt like Pete never gave him any rhythm and really playing ugly tennis besides his serve, but missing ball sprain. Did Sampras do that kind of on purpose and just make his move at that certain moment where it's like, you're not trying to miss, but it's like, yeah, if I miss in the early stages, it's not really giving him much. And then at 4-all of a sudden, I'm going to focus harder and break and win the set. I mean, did he pace it like that, or he just finally got hot later in the set?
Well, I think Pete, Pete was one of the best big match players I've ever seen, maybe the best. And I think a lot of it was because he trusted his abilities. And against Andre, Pete had the same kind of mentality that Roger does about pragmatism. In other words, Pete used to just say, this guy's the greatest returner on the planet, so I've got to serve well. And I remember in the finals of Wimbledon in 87, I believe, he and Andre played in the finals. I think it was 87. Pete beat him in one of the best matches I'd ever seen, and Pete's second serve speed average was up 7 miles an hour in the finals against Andre. And so after we won, I like to kind of get all my information and keep my notes. After he won, like the next day flying home or something, I remember asking him, I said, I checked, and this is what happened with your second serve speed. Why? And he goes, well, 2 reasons. One is because it's Andre and I have to, and 2 is it's because I can. And so again, that's not him being arrogant. It's like, I've got to do it. So I got to do what I do best. He's the greatest returner on the planet. So that's how I'm going to play, win or lose. So it's a very long-winded way of saying he trusted the way he needed to play. And that was trying to take the racket out of Andre's hand. And I always like to make the analogy in their matchup. It's a great pitcher versus a great hitter. Most times in baseball, the great pitcher wins. And in that era, when the courts were a little bit quicker, Pete won more of their big matches because of that. And some of it was because of the style. Pete knew that he didn't want to get in huge, long, grinding rallies with Andre for 5 sets. So at the beginning, it was more hit or miss. And then at the end of the sets, if he needed to grind out some points, sure, he's athletic enough. He's got the great forehand, Sampras, his backhand. He could keep it neutral enough with Andre until he got a forehand, but he didn't want to do it all the time. But at the end of the sets, he would do it. And what that did was, leading up to that moment, didn't give Andre a lot of rhythm. So then Andre would get to 4-all or 5-all or whatever, and he wouldn't have hit a lot of balls, which was tough. And then all of a sudden you get in a long rally. And then you have to deal with the other part of it, which is the guy's not giving me any looks on his serve. So it kind of played into Pete's hands. So I don't think it was a conscious, I'm going to miss balls on purpose. It was, I'm going to be offensive from the beginning. If I miss some, that's fine because it's how I want to play. I'm still going to hit my spots with my serve, so I'm going to serve big. And if I miss them, I miss them. It's Andre. I've got to hit my spots. So again, it was pragmatism. It was being realistic. And I think that's what he really trusted himself. And that word trust, it's easy to say, it's very hard to do in big moments. And the historic greats trust themselves in big moments.
Very cool. Matt, you got a final one?
Yeah, it's kind of a lot of ideas rolled into one, but Nadal always talks about playing with the right feelings. In your book, you talk about playing with the right feelings. I remember I got to talk to John Isner right after he lost in Cincinnati to Dimitrov, and I think it was the semifinals, and he said something to me about, I think he's talking about serving in the tiebreak to stay alive. You just get this little tightness in your arm, your shoulder's like a little heavy all of a sudden. And, I know a lot of recreational players and people like me who started later in life, we can get to where like our whole body goes numb on us and everything's
Sure.
a lot more than just the tightness in the shoulder. So I know you talked about it a little bit earlier, but what do you think are some keys for people who are just going into a panic out there? Because I know it's a big issue for probably a lot of people who watch this. They all know what it's like to be in a league match and then
Sure.
you got a lot of tightness going on.
Yeah, it happens with everybody, and people don't realize, playing your club championships, being in the finals with 8 people watching, or interleague when there's 30 people watching, it's the same feelings that you have in your stomach. Sampras and Federer and Nadal and Serena and Venus and all the pros have that too. It's just because it's at Wimbledon doesn't mean it's any different. It's the same thing. But the reason that the best get through that is, number one, they accept them. They know that it's normal to feel like that. And then number two, they work around them. They find ways to trust the process. They find ways to trust their game and know that they've hit enough balls in their game plan, in their strategy, that they want to win or lose doing that. And they forget about the what ifs. They can't totally blank them out. They still, believe me, Sampras knows at 5-4 in the 4th set serving against Agassi at Wimbledon that he's at the finish line. He knows that. But he trusts his game. Doesn't mean he's not nervous. He trusts it because of practice. So for me, for every player, club player, college player, junior player, understand your game, understand what you do well, find the things in practice that allow you to trust that and do that in practice, because you bring that baggage to the big moments, and then just accept that you're going to be nervous. That's normal. That's fine. Take a little bit more time, take a couple deep breaths, and remind yourself of what the process is, not what the result might be. What the process is, not what the result might be. And then no matter what happens after each point, evaluate yourself on the process of the last point, not the result, the process. Because if you evaluate on your process, you can then say, did the right thing, just missed that backhand. Was a little bit too jammed. Good thing, got to move on to the next point. But if you say, oh God, I totally was thinking about what if I lose this point, I got away from my game plan, you then can self-correct again. So again, stay in the process, be self-aware, keep it simple, and remember what you do best. But most of all, whenever you start to remind yourself of result orientation, get back to what gets you there. Get back to what you need to do to get you to that result, and let the result take care of itself.
Awesome.
That's a great way to finish.
Very powerful
Thank you
stuff.
so much. So, guys, you can get Paul Annacone's book. Tell us, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with? And also tell people how they can get it. We're going to put a link right below this video. So all I have to do is click the link, and they're going to be off and running, be able to get your book, which is awesome. That's where 90% of our questions came from, is straight out of Paul's book. And you see how much great information is in there.
Well, thanks, you guys. I really appreciate it. Look, the book is a labor of love for me. I've been really fortunate to be around some of the greatest of all time, and I've tried to be a sponge more than anything. And I think to be a good coach or to be successful in anything, you better be able to listen and absorb stuff. And every day I learn. And so I try to just put all my notes together. And it was 10, 12, 13 years in the making, a lot of different stops and starts. But I love the book. The book is Coaching for Life. You can get it at Amazon.com. You can get it at IRIE Books, IRIE books.com, or you can get it on my website, paulannacone.com. And paulannacone.com also has the digital version if you want to get something for a tablet. That's on there. And not quite sure about the audiobook yet. Haven't done that version. I've had a bunch of people ask me about it, but I haven't done it. And 2 reasons. One is because people keep telling me to do it, but I think my voice is terrible, so I don't want to do it myself, and I'm not sure who should do it. So maybe audiobook, maybe down the road, but get the book. It'll help you. It's a good read. There's some good anecdotes, some really good stories. But look, you guys heard it today. I'm a big process guy. I think process helps you in every endeavor, whether it's my college student son, whether it's my daughter dealing with work stuff, whether it's a 12-year-old trying to get better at guitar, whether it's a 14-year-old trying to shoot a foul shot. Whatever it is, process will lead you to the result. And boy, I've been lucky. I've had a front row seat to some of the greats. So I hope you guys enjoy the book. And I really appreciate you guys being patient enough to wait a little bit for me to get on the call. So thanks.
Oh, we loved it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Well, Thanks. We'll do it again. You know how to get a hold of me.
Yeah, that's right. All different ways. Okay, guys, we're gonna sign off, and that was just a real treat to be with Paul Annacone today.